Thank you, Peter. I should just emphasize to people, I am no longer, I'm an emeritus professor now. I retired a few years ago, but the academic never dies. And I really appreciate the opportunity tonight to speak to people because it sort of reminds me of my lovely days as a professor when you had a whole bunch of interesting people listening to you, something of a captive audience. I realize not entirely captive tonight, but anyway, I hope I make it worth your while. I'm going to talk about the Battle of Vimy Ridge in my own title, some salient aspects, and I'm really going to pose a series of questions, about 7 questions, and then sort of answer them. One of the points I want to raise is that some of the elements that, at least a part of the accepted wisdom about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, certainly that are prevalent in popular history and often in academic history as well. I'm going to take to task some of these points, and at no point do I want anybody to think, well, my goodness, I'm trying to be an iconoclast here, and it's not that. Battle of Vimy Ridge was an enormous Canadian achievement, and it doesn't need untoward embellishment. It stands on its own feet. So that's really what I'm trying to do, is to give credit where credit is due, and again, give some of the larger context of what was going on, at least within the battle itself. So what was at stake? Operationally, well, as has already been pointed out, this was part, not a small part, but nonetheless part of a larger British offensive at Arras, which dragged on for over a month and turned out rather badly. Ended up looking more like the Battle of Somme than anything new by the time it was over. But anyway, the northern flank of the BEF's Arras offensive in April 1917, that's Vimy Ridge, and the role of Horne's First Army and Byng's Corps within that army, the Canadian Corps, and one British supporting division was to, in fact, capture that ridge and at the very beginning and neutralize it as, if nothing else, a German observation position to shell British rear areas to the south, and also to prevent, in a worst case scenario, some sort of German counterattack. So that was the operational intention. More broadly, like the Arras offensive itself, it was going to test the new attacking doctrine that had been developed from the Somme experiences, the not very happy Somme experiences, in 1916. And much thought had been gone into by British, Canadian, Australian senior officers and others in the aftermath, or during even, and certainly in the aftermath during the winter of 1916-17, as to how to fight better, because the Somme, from Allied point of view, from the British Empire point of view, was at best a Pyrrhic victory, and no too many Pyrrhic victories and you end up being the loser. So there was a new doctrine that emerged, which has been called bite and hold attacks, basically a set piece attack where you would use your artillery to literally tear off a piece of the enemy's defensive line and then occupy the ground and hold it with men. The reverse, really, what we're trying to do at the Somme, which was take the ground with men and hold it with artillery. So artillery was going to do a lot of the taking. The infantry would occupy it, and then hopefully the Germans would cooperate, as they usually did, by counterattacking. That was their strategy, and then they would be the attrition would start working against the Germans. The attackers would lose men, of course, initially, but the attrition would start working against the Germans during this counterattack phase. The key was to not go too far. The Allies had had a tremendous tendency up until the new doctrine of bite and hold was adopted to grasp defeat from the jaws of victory by taking initial successes as an indication that they could rupture the German lines completely and break through. And we've already seen examples of that being discussed for 1917 by Robert Naval. The Canadian context established the worth of the new command structure and the accompanying internal reforms of the Canadian Corps, which had been underway since the late spring of 1916, and I'm going to talk to a bit about this toward the end. But suffice to say, the end of the malign influence of Sam Hughes as Minister of Militia and Defense, the introduction of meritocracy to the Canadian Corps, particularly its senior echelons, and so on. Okay, so to test this new doctrine, the British in general were interested in that. It had not been tried out, and there was great hope vested in bite and hold attacks as a style of offensive in a trench warfare situation. And then in the Canadian context, there was really a question about could the problems that ailed the Canadian Corps up to that time, which had been quite severe, had they been remediated by these other reforms? What did the Germans think? Well, prior to the attack, there was remarkably little confidence actually in the German army and German high command that Vimy could be held. There was a general feeling by those close to the sector that any determined assault, especially if it enjoyed initial success, early success, would in fact be victorious. There was no sense that it was the most formidably defended position on the Western Front, et cetera, sometimes one reads in Canadian accounts. After the attack, Germans saw it as a saw-off. It appears on the battle honors of German regiments that were there, which usually don't put your defeats on there. But it was certainly not seen as a loss. Now, some of this may have been rationalization to a point, but I think it also bears contemplating that the Germans thought they'd done pretty well, all things considered, because their expectations were that it's about as well as they could probably do. It was certainly not seen as a disastrous defeat. So why was Vimy Ridge a victory? I mean, clearly it was a victory, a sound plan. It was well aligned, that is, the plan was well aligned with Western Front combat realities. And while challenging, it was definitely a challenging objective, it was clearly doable. Lots of preparation time, 3 months plus in some cases. It's worth remembering when one looks at Vimy and all the preparatory work and so on, the planning, the artillery plan, the logistics and so on and so forth, that they had 3 months to do this, and it took 3 months to do it properly. But in 1918, during the 100 Days campaign, Battle of Amiens, in the case of the Canadian Corps, battles of Amiens, Drocourt Queant Line, and Canal du Nord, we did this thing 3 times in 2 months, and in the case of Amiens, 1 week's preparation to do the artillery plan and so on. So we got very good at this kind of bite and hold attack, okay? Besides lots of preparation time, I got down here, I have it 3 times. Artillery. The key to bite and hold attack doctrine was artillery superiority on steroids, which is what the British were developing during the winter of 1916-17. And in fact, it would become more and more pronounced in the rest of 1917 and 1918. The key to bite and hold attacks was artillery superiority, overwhelming artillery superiority. And we had that. And in the British way of assigning extra artillery resources to attacking formations and then not leaving them there. In other words, you had what you came with, divisional artillery and so on, a little bit of extra corps artillery in the case of the Canadian Corps, but 2/3 of the heavy artillery and 2/3 of the field artillery, which were used for counter battery work and barrage work at Vimy, were in fact British. It's also worth remembering that it wasn't entirely a Canadian operation. Anglo-Canadian actions, why was Vimy a victory? Preliminary bombardment, I'm not going to go into the details of the attack doctrine, but preliminary bombardment was exceptionally well done. Counter battery program was exceptionally well done. Severe degrading of German defenses. The defenses were severely degraded before the infantry were thrown into the battle. Anglo-Canadian actions, infantry attack in stages, the leapfrogging, in other words, using fresh troops for each stage of the attack, expert use of creeping barrages. These were all, I might add, these were all things that were part of bite and hold doctrine and were being used by the British and the Australians. The Canadians, as we'll see, embraced this kind of change doctrine with a passion, but it was British doctrine, and the British attacks were doing it. The first few days of the Arras offensive also demonstrated this new doctrine, and in fact was very successful. It's when the British continued to press and press and press over the weeks that things deteriorated. Planning for contingencies. Seems like common sense, but you know, it hadn't been done to the degree it should have been done before in previous battles, and bite and hold called for that. And I might add, the command of the Canadian Corps, General Byng and his Brigadier General Staff, his Principal Staff Officer Percy Radcliffe, also embraced this idea in spades. Conservative objectives. It was an ambitious attack plan, but it was conservative. It was all bite and hold attacks where you're going to go as far as your own artillery could carry you and no farther. No matter how good things looked, you weren't going to be seduced into feeling you'd broken through and then get counterattacked in unprepared positions and so on. So there were conservative objectives, difficult objectives, but conservative objectives. There was a realization by the Canadian and British generals commanding the operation that the infantry had to show initiative, a lot of initiative, after the inevitable breakdown of communications in attacks. For a cell phone in the First World War. They're still using runners, pigeons, et cetera, to communicate in the First World War. Communications always broke down at the sharp end. And this had led to confusion in the past. Now, basically, we're going to make a merit out of necessity, which is to say they were going to train infantry units, particularly companies and platoons, small units, to be self-sufficient and to act independently to carry the offensive forward. So there was a recognition of sort of reality and how to make a merit out of it. Okay. German actions, inability, that is to say, what were the German contributions to the victory of Vimy Ridge? Well, inability to deploy counterattacking forces, which are the heart of German defensive doctrine. They had adopted, in the aftermath of the Somme, a less rigid form of defense, elastic defense. Unfortunately, they couldn't implement it at Vimy because of geography. In other words, it was too much up and down. And the result was that there was a very strong line, although we degraded it considerably with artillery before the attack. But it was thin, it was narrow, and the German reserves were far, far too far to the rear, in some cases 25 kilometers to the rear, to be brought up in a suitable time to make a difference in terms of counterattacking. That wasn't, as I said, largely as a result of not of German overconfidence, but just of the geography. So what looked like a very formidable position in some ways had its inherent weaknesses. So the Vimy Ridge attack plan, whose was it? My students used to tell me, after reading a lot of popular Canadian history, that it was in fact Arthur Currie, who was a divisional commander, one of the 4 divisional commanders, and the best of them, and a very bright man, and who would take over command of the Corps in June, several months after the Vimy attack, and lead it to the end of the war. But in fact, there was input from throughout the Corps into planning for the attack, but ultimately it followed British Expeditionary Force doctrine, this bite and hold doctrine. What he had was a commanding officer, Julian Byng, who was a tremendous trainer of men and handler of men, and got the most out of his subordinates, so was open to the subordinates' views and so on, as was his Brigadier General Staff, his Chief Staff Officer, Percy Radcliffe. And these were 2 British officers who had been parachuted into the Canadian Corps in the late spring of 1916 to try to save it from itself, so to speak. But there's no question Byng and Radcliffe's thumbprints are all over the planning. And yes, Currie and others, but there's no doubt that Byng was an active hands-on Corps commander. The role of Arthur Currie, again, he was the principal other person to involve, senior commander to be involved in planning, simply because he was very good, and Byng greatly admired him and was in a sense mentoring him to take over the Corps command eventually. And so Currie deserved an awful lot of credit, but he was not, Byng wasn't just sitting there on his thumbs. Byng was in charge, and Radcliffe, always a good staff officer behind every successful general. And Currie certainly plays a leading role as well. And that person is sometimes forgotten, a Canadian artillery expert, Andrew McNaughton, would go on to command the Canadian Army for a while, at least overseas during World War II. Andy McNaughton was counter-battery staff officer, which means he was in charge of basically the heavy artillery. There was, in fact, a British general named Massey who was in charge of the heavy artillery. Massey was sick all the time. And basically, as is often the case in armies, the staff officer, in fact, is pulling the strings. And McNaughton was a brilliant artillery officer. He was the most innovative Canadian officer produced in the war, senior Canadian officer. Had there not been a regulation or a practice in the Canadian Corps, originating with the government in Ottawa, that Canadian officers would not be promoted outside the Corps. British officers would be brought in if they were needed, but Canadian officers would not be promoted outside the Corps. McNaughton would have been at Hague's headquarters. He was every bit the equal of the artillery innovators at General Headquarters, the British artillery initiators like the also named Hague, but not the same man as Douglas. How important was success at Vimy Ridge? In other words, we get a success, we win a success on our merits. How important was it? Well, to the BEF, the key thing was simply, it wasn't the Canadian nation building, I can assure you that. For them, it was a vindication of bite and hold attack doctrine. A great deal of had been invested in this new doctrine and in training the artillery and the infantry to carry it out, and that had to be tried. And a lot rode on that because not everybody was convinced in the BEF, including some of the Canadian commanders, that it was the way to go. It was time to abandon the old methods. They should be tried again, just nuanced differently, more, I've tried more, this kind of thing. And it's very difficult to change a doctrine right in the middle of a war. Anyway, it had to be tried, and had it failed, that would have been it for bite and hold attacks. And as it turns out, that doctrine was very effective, given the relatively blunt instruments that were available in the First World War to carry out attacks. Bite and hold was in fact a really good idea. Okay. So the British were very interested in its being vindicated. It was vindicated in the early stages of the larger Arras offensive. As I said, thereafter it became rather obscure whether it worked or not. Vimy was a really nice strapped in a bow kind of attack. There was no question that bite and hold had worked extremely well at Vimy. And so that was, it's no reason, there was no accident rather that practically every senior British commander came to tour the battlefield afterwards and be briefed on exactly what we had done and so on and so forth. To the Canadian Corps, that, yes, but there were other things, of course, we understand. It was the first clear victory that the Canadian Corps won. Up to that time, Canadian military achievements had been checkered. They had been. And it was expected that it would take a while for the Army to learn, and particularly its Canadian officers to learn. Most of them were amateurs. But nonetheless, there were other problems to do with lack of meritocracy, Sam Hughes's dictatorship over the Army, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of bad things happened in the Army. And the British were not, the British wanted manpower, but they wanted effective units, and the Canadian Corps wasn't terribly effective. Hence, sending Byng and Radcliffe and various others to try to reform it the previous year. So a clear victory. It was a clear victory. There's just no way any Canadian in the Corps could look at that and say we'd done really well. Okay, a great morale boost for officers and men. The Corps never lost a game. I mean, they had some rocky periods in battles for sure, but I mean, they never lost again. And one can't underestimate the effect that had on morale. And lastly, the question I want to raise is, was there anything, uniquely or specifically Canadian about the Vimy Ridge attack? I'm going to quote here from, of all places, Wikipedia, but it's actually an exceptionally good article in terms of the research and analysis in Wikipedia on Vimy Ridge. But the quote I have here is, historians attribute the success of the Canadian Corps to technical and tactical innovation. Tick mark, yes. Meticulous planning, yes. Powerful artillery support and extensive training, yes. As well as German inability to properly apply defense in depth. Yes, okay. The problem is, and I saw this over and over again and with my students, again, reading Canadian sources, that the implication there is that it was uniquely Canadian, that these kinds of techniques, the extensive preparation and so on, the expert use of massed artillery, all of this stuff was unique to the Canadians, and that's simply wrong. It was the British Expeditionary Force doctrine, which had been shaped and also was adopted by the two principal Dominion contingents, the Australian Imperial Force and the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Followed the BEF bite and hold doctrine, that is to say, the Vimy plan and the Vimy execution followed BEF bite and hold doctrine to the T, both with respect to infantry and artillery doctrine. The thumbprint of Byng and Radcliffe on Corps leadership all the way down to battalion command was manifest, and British staff work throughout. We forget that virtually all the senior staff officers and most of the middle-ranking staff officers were British. And at a time when the British Army was expanding and needed all the staff officers it had, it was very generous in giving as many as it did to the Canadian Corps. And they knew the Canadians could be something if they could get their act together. They would be a major contributor because of the large size of the Corps. And so there was their own interest. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a relatively small number of British professionals had an enormous impact on the training and professionalization of the Canadian Corps, which was really on display at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Why has the debt of British expertise been downplayed? Still downplayed, frankly, although less than it used to be. If you're going to have a birth of a nation and so on, if the reason the Canadians do well is because they shed their colonial shackles, it's pretty hard to point to accepting British commanders, British staff officers, adopting basically British doctrine. They had to do these things, that is to say, the doctrine, because the army was one great imperial alliance, and they had to be interchangeable parts. How anybody could think the Canadians could do something different and still function effectively in the BEF. But anyway, I think it has to do with this kind of post-war nationalist business. Willingness of Canadian officers to embrace new infantry tactics, I think they deserve a lot of credit. I've done a lot of studying this myself, and these amateur warriors, I mean that as a compliment, they weren't professionally trained soldiers, the brigadiers, divisional commanders, battalion commanders, artillery commanders, and so on, had been running lumber yards and banks and construction companies and large-scale firearms and law offices and so on only 2 years earlier. They had a lot to learn. They had more to learn than British professionals did, but they had a lot less to forget too. And so they, in the hands of somebody like Byng, or people like Byng and Radcliffe, who were great teachers and saw the potential of Canadian leadership in the Corps. This was a marriage made in heaven, and the capable non-professionals had mastered the art of battle and the art of war. That was certainly apparent by Vimy. Enthusiasm, esprit de corps, there's no doubt the Canadians, as with the Australians, had a certain level of enthusiasm, and certainly esprit de corps, the beginnings of a sort of a nationalism in some cases was at work, and all these things kind of cheered them on. They were volunteers and so on. Finally, was there anything, continuing on that theme, never lose sight of the fact that there's big stuff going on beyond Borden's government's reform of the Canadian Expeditionary Force and of its fighting arm, the Canadian Corps, beginning in late spring 1916, placing military operations in the hands of military and civilian professionals, meant that for the first time, the total equaled the sum of the parts for the Canadian Corps. And thereafter, the total would be greater than the sum of the parts. It was the end of amateurism at 1916 and into early 1917, and the results were manifestly apparent at Vimy. The malign influence of the Mullah, as many Army officers refer to Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense. His megalomania ended. He was basically cashiered. And as I say, meritocracy was introduced. It unlocked the potential of the Canadian Army. It showed at Vimy that this potential was being unlocked. And it was more and more clear as the war went on over the next 18 months. Canadian Corps went from success to success and became a more formidable military weapon by the fall of 1918 than it had certainly been at the time of Vimy, which was pretty formidable enough. Anyway, I finished my comments now, and I hand it back to Peter.